Hello and welcome to Pensions in 10 with me, David Brooks, and a new co-host this week. I'm joined by Fiona White. This week we talk you through the DB surplus and Megafunds stories that broke last week, and we also talk about the Boots cases currently being heard by the Pensions Ombudsman.
So recently then we've had the government have announced and put information out about the DB surplus and Megafunds. David, what information and thoughts have you got on this?
Well, yeah, so this is quite big news. It's been well trailed. Obviously, we all knew they were going to be doing this as consultation from last year on DB surpluses, of course, with the overall target of trying to make the repayment of a surplus in a DB scheme back to the sponsoring employer easier while having that scheme and run on, so you don't have to wind the scheme up to get the money out. You can pay it out because there's quite strict rules around how you do that for an ongoing scheme. So the government want to make it easier. If they make it easier, then it might make it more attractive for schemes to invest in riskier assets because they would know then that the upside, the employer could get their hands on it sooner rather than later. And there's kind of two big moving parts to that. So how do you set a funding basis? How well funded should a scheme be before you can realise that a surplus is there? And then the second thing is, how do you make sure then that you're not compromising the security of members' benefits? Because the last thing you want is necessarily paying out surplus and then a few years down the line a deficit emerging and not paying all the benefits in the scheme, or even needing more money back from the employer or something like that. So the government has said that the funding basis will be based on a low dependency basis, and that's the basis that basically you no longer would expect to need support from the employer. So the investments, as you know from the funding code, we know that investments will be locked down to sort of low risk environment for up to that low dependency basis, and then they'd have the excess to invest in exciting things, hence the whole point of this. But one key area that people are worried about is the trustee fiduciary duty to make sure members are paid their benefits. And there's some quite strongly worded phrases in the legislation and Section 37 of Pensions Act 95. There's another Section 37, I think that's Pensions Act 93. If it's not, it's switch them around. But basically that means that trustees have to be allowing these surpluses to be paid if it's in the members' interests. And that's pretty hard for a trustee board to do. How would it be in the members' interest to repay a surplus to the employer? And so the government is saying they're going to have a look at that rule and see if that's a way of making that slightly easier for trustees to make that decision, and so therefore easier for them to return the surplus. So we'll have to see how that goes. It'll be interesting to see how they go through that wording to make sure that trustees aren't put in a difficult position if the employer wants to get some money out, but the trustees aren't too sure about it being the right thing to do. So that's difficult, and that could be the area of any controversy in the future, and that's definitely something to keep an eye on. The funding basis is a funding basis is a funding basis, and the surplus is a surplus. It's not going to be as much money as the government thinks it's going to be, but whether it's something. So there's also a few other little bits as well in there around the public sector consolidator idea. So that's probably being pared back slightly, and to be more of a vehicle for smaller schemes that are underfunded to go into and use a public sector consolidator rather than something just for small schemes in general. So more of a funding basis entry rather than a scheme size basis. But that's still something that looks like it's going to be investigated. Some people are disappointed, myself included, that there wasn't anything in there around how to pay out surplus to a member. So a member can share some of the upside of these surplus payments. And because of the authorised taxation system we have since 2006, if a payment isn't defined in legislation, then it's unauthorised and you get a whole heap of tax problems and these kind of things. And having something more easy to pay benefits to members in a tax sort of authorised way would have been helpful. And so I suspect the government will listen to that eventually when this gets further down the line. But for now, I think they're focusing on just getting the ducks in a row about the funding and the trustee power. Also, at the same time, over on DC land, the Megafunds plan has been far more fleshed out, so we know more about how big these schemes have to be. So 25 billion in a default arrangement within a provider, so they could have smaller default arrangements, but their biggest one has to be 25 billion at least by 2030. Or if you're 10 billion and above and you can show how you will get there eventually, so in the next 2 or 3 years, then you can still carry on. But that 25 billion is now sort of being locked in. In addition, they're saying about the VFM framework, that'll be up and running by 2028. And they've also talked about how they're going to structure this mandation rule to sort of encourage or enforce trustees to invest in productive finance and UK productive finance by 2030 as well. And so they're talking about how they're going to structure that into some sort of qualitative analysis and all this kind of It sounds a bit messy. I'll be honest. Reading what the government have written, I still think they don't really want to use this power. I think this power will remain on the shelf as something that they will use if they very much have to, not because they willy-nilly want to. So yeah, it feels a little bit fuzzy at the moment about how they're going to do that. They know it's difficult because markets move and decisions have to be made. Opportunities have to be there. It's going to be quite a tricky one for the government to do. And I think for now the industry seems relatively on course, but it'd be interesting to see how that drafting goes.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at 2028 and 2030. It sounds like a long time away, but actually it's not. That's going to come around so quickly. So it'll be interesting to see how and when they'll make those decisions, and then the trustees, the decisions they need to make, how easy or not it's going to be for them to.
Yeah, no, you're right as well. The VFM stuff, so we've been talking about VFM for ages. That's going to be in the pension schemes bill, but the first assessments under the VFM won't be until 2028. And they were talking about trying to get to sort of Megafunds size and efficiencies, all these sort of things by 2030. That's only 2 years. And so, and there's going to be teething problems with that, with the reporting and what the metrics are. And, there's different, we don't really know how it's going to work yet because we started off having this RAG system. If your scheme's underperforming, you have this red, amber, green. And now they're thinking, well, we're going to, FCA and TPO did a podcast the other day saying they're probably going to move away from that. So how we're going to be assessing what's good, what's not, is still in the world of the unknown.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah. Okay, Thea, for our final story this week, we're going to have a quick look at the Pensions Ombudsman, who's having a look themselves at the Boots pension scheme, and they've got a couple of complaints. Can you fill us in on the story here?
Yes. So Boots recently gone through the buy-in, a rather large buy-in, 4.8 billion. But during that, the decision was made to remove the ability to take unreduced pension at age 60, which was always in play before, part of the rules. So there was questions around if that was even possible to start with, as to if it could be removed as part of the buy-in. But basically, originally, there was no reduction age between 60 and 65, and a 4% reduction for each year taken before 60 down to age 55. So the buy-in all rooted from Walgreens, that's the owner of Boots, removing pension liabilities, allowing them to consider the sale of Boots. That's where it all came from. Though last year, that got scrapped. They decided, due to the market conditions, it just wasn't the right time to sell. But following on from these changes that have gone in following the buy-in, there's been complaints coming through the Ombudsman, which is, understandable. Lots of members have received recent statements which have shown what they would have got, early retirement without that reduction. So you can imagine there's probably going to be quite a few. The initial investigations have happened within the Ombudsman to make sure that their jurisdiction was fine and they could carry on investigating formally, which that has been confirmed on one of the cases which they've published recently. So we're just going to kind of look at that. But yeah, so people that have planned for some time to retire, maybe even in the next year at age 60, unreduced, are now being faced with the reduction. So Boots have had a few questions put forward to themselves via This Is Money publication. And so they have confirmed that the option for members to apply to the trustees to grant them consent for early retirement, which wasn't reduced, has been applied, but not to all members. So they have given an option following this transition to some members. It's not clear as to which ones or why, but some members do still have the option to do it. Discretion nature of early retirement, as with all schemes, if there's discretion in place, it's in the rules. The Huntsman was in the rules, and so the quotes do apparently, well, I say apparently, but they will be caveated to say, it is a discretion. So that is another argument as to why they could proceed with this removal. The members that have received the statement, so for many years, these are the ones which are going to be sort of affected greatly because they would have planned based on what they've had. So if they've received a recent quotation for early retirement, again, it would have had on the letter to say it's an estimate, so that removes the legalities of the issue. And that's quite a heavy background as to why they've pushed forward with this. They've taken the legal advice on the whole transaction and specifically on this, and they've suggested and said that it's fine because it was just an estimate. Unlike other discretionary benefits, though, I think they've kept in for pension for dependents as an example. They've had to look at everything because it just wouldn't have been affordable if they'd kept all of those discretions in place. So they've had to really go through and think about it carefully as to which ones to remove, which ones not to make sure the affordability was there for this. So yes, there's quite a lot of sort of points that Boots have got out there to sort of reaffirm and reassure that, this is all above board. But, people were expecting a certain amount of monies, so they would go to the Ombudsman.
Yeah.
So they have had a second case, which they're going to be publishing shortly as well, but they're just going through those initial investigations to make sure jurisdiction's all above board. So we should be seeing some further information. But I think generally it's going to be very, very, I'm going to say interesting again, because everything's interesting in pensions. It's going to be interesting actually how many people come forward with the similar complaints and what the overall outcome is going to be of this. How many, how much, what are we looking at? Will anything be overturned? Will anything be made, unwound? Or if they can't even do that, I'm not sure when it gets to this part of the transaction.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And it's also going to feed into the debate around schemes that do decide to do a risk transfer and have to crystallise those discretions. The discretions are sat there and the trustees have taken it on a case-by-case basis, maybe with some precedents in certain circumstances. But then when you come to do a risk transfer, it's quite often that that insurer will not want those discretions there, so you have to make a decision. And in this case, I think there's two types of cases, but the case where it's purely discretion, the trustees have decided, well, that discretion no longer exists. And that's a downside, as you say, to those people that have been planning for that expectation to retire at age 60 on an unreduced basis, because that's what it always has been. So it's whether having a risk transfer is right for members. So we start having that discussion, which you've seen, played out on social media and on LinkedIn and places like that. We'll be writing articles about how run-on should be the position for schemes to take, because it's better for members in the long run, because they'll get those, more likely to get those discretionary benefits. So it's going to be, my interest in that is just trying to see how that plays out and to see how the Ombudsman comes down on those kind of decision making. And also trustees having to take legal advice of what they can and can't do. The Ombudsman that might end up being part of that legal advice, that decision making when schemes are doing risk transfers.
Yeah. And it's also sort of the simplification when trustees are going through these buy-ins, they do try to make it simplified as best possible. So it's a difficult decision trustees have to make on these things. And the legalities of it as well. It's a tricky one.
Yeah.
So those are some interesting topics. I think everybody will agree with that, David. So I'd like to say thank you for having me here. No doubt you'll see me again sometime. But really enjoyed it, and pop your questions in below, and look forward to seeing you again.
Great. Yeah, thanks guys. We'll see you on the next episode of Pensions in 10.